Um, Hosea is the only northern prophet. Amos works in the north, but he's a southern guy. So he's a transplant. He gets sent up there. Hosea is the only one. Everybody else is at work in Judah, in the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, Jerusalem and around there. But Hosea stands alone. He is at work in the last 20 years or so before the kingdom is overrun by Assyria. It's a period of absolute chaos. They've been under King Jeroboam II for about 20 years, and things were good. It's stability. And then when Jeroboam died, his son took over, as is the way things work in the world, the ancient world. And in about 6 months, he was assassinated and another guy took over, and that one didn't last but a year. In all, there were 7 kings, we think. It's a little hard to tell in that span of 20 years before the nation of Israel. Judah is the southern kingdom, before the nation of Israel is completely overrun by Assyria. And a lot of what happens during that time period is attempts to appease the Assyrian king who was threatening on the border. And all that does is to postpone the inevitable. And so we have a series of weak kings and poor leadership. It's just a really tough time. Okay, can y'all hear me now? Is it much better on Zoom? Okay, good. Glad to know that. Thank you for passing out timelines.
Yeah.
Because
Anybody else, if you want your own, Mary Ann,
We can share this one,
Okay.
thanks.
the one that Tessa made for Vista.
the timeline shows Amos and then Hosea. Okay, they're here above the line. But that doesn't mean north or south. It just is a placement on the line that makes room for everybody. Okay. I'm glad to see it above the line though, because Hosea is in the north and Amos is too. You can see that they overlap slightly. They overlap in time actually, as well as on the line here. Now, the resources that I've used would place Joel at those later dates, as well as Obadiah. And Jonah is, dating Jonah is pretty much a crapshoot. It could fall any number of places on the timeline. My tendency is to say that Amos and Hosea are the earliest of these minor prophets. But I mention that only to tell you that dating these guys is not an easy task. There are a lot of factors that go into it. And part of landing on a date is sometimes you just have to choose, is this factor more important or is this factor more important? You know, and I tend to place those other guys later on, just because of the way I look at those factors. So partly it depends on things like the headings and the writings themselves, if there is one. Often there isn't. The headings in the case of Hosea are wonderfully helpful and historically accurate. Okay. Unlike the headings that you would find in the Gospel of Luke, for instance. Okay. The Gospel of Luke places Luke's writing, or places Jesus in a very specific time period, except there is no time period in which those people that Luke names overlap. And so you think, oh, look at all this good. Oh, nope.
Yeah.
Luke obviously wrote that considerably later and was a little fuzzy. But in this case, it's all very good. And I want you to take a look at that. Hosea, a son of Beri, in the days of kings Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah of Judah. Judah, folks, is the southern kingdom. Hosea is at work in the northern kingdom. And in the days of King Jeroboam, son of Joash of Israel. That's the northern king. Now, why would you tag it with Southern Kingdom people if it's a Northern Kingdom book?
Oh, because God's voice was for both.
Because what?
God's voice was for both, I'd say. It was universal.
Broaden your
That's-
audience,
Yeah.
broaden your audience.
Broaden your audience, yeah. You're both absolutely right. Okay. In a very strict historical sense, it's because the editor who did that, who put it together, is working primarily for a Southern audience, because the Northern audience is no more. And so it's like dating a book about Canadian events in terms of who was president in the US.
Except
That-
that it does still exist.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. But if we're gonna know when this was happening in Canada, if you don't tell me that it was in the time of Washington, I'm probably not gonna have a clue. Because I don't know much about Canada. That's the kind of clue that's hidden in the text that I'm always glad to see if it means anything. Now, we're so far removed that for us, the primary answer is because God's word is universal. But in the days in which this was committed to paper, gathered up and put together, it's because the audience was the Southern Kingdom, trying to make sense of the history, what had happened to the so-called 10 lost tribes. Well, Assyria took them over. That's what happened. The Hebrew text for Hosea is very badly preserved. Again, in part, I think, because of that Northern Kingdom, Southern Kingdom thing. The Northern Kingdom was a little more chaotic. It was lost 150 years prior to Judah being overrun. There are just a whole lot more factors that went into chaos and dismemberment of the text than there were in the South. And so I tell you this because if you do a side-by-side with several English versions, you will find places where the English translation is going to vary widely. They'll have you wondering, well, why in the world is that so different here to another place? It's because part of it is a best guess effort at making sense of a Hebrew text where part of it may be missing. Okay, how was the sentence supposed to end? If you've tried to
Just
read,
pick something, huh?
yeah, if you've tried to read an old letter that's crumbling along the edges. I have a lot of paper that has come to me from my great-grandparents and beyond. And some of it is hard to make out because the edges are gone. We'll look at some examples of that in chapters 3 and 4. But for now, I'll just tell you, always read the footnotes. Hosea is the only book of the 12, the only one of the 12 that has a biographical section. Chapters 1 through 3 are considered biographical. Chapters 4 through 14 are more typical of the prophetic books in that it's the collected sayings of the prophet. Okay, are you ready to dive into the text itself? Did I tell you Hosea was not a happy guy?
Yeah.
Hosea wasn't a happy guy. Chapter 1. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said, "Go take for yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom." For the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord. Tessa talked about covenant last week. The covenant between God and Israel, Israel broadly, not just the northern kingdom, is often portrayed in metaphor as a marriage relationship. Now, God's covenant was pretty much a one-sided covenant. It's not a modern contract in which I have a stance and you have a stance, and we come together and sort out our differences and figure out what we're going to agree to. God's covenant is not that. God's covenant is, this is what I will do for you. And these are the benefits you will attain if you live the way I want you to live, which is in your best interest. On our side of that, we may shake our hands at God and say, but it's still in our best interest. I mean, you look at the Ten Commandments. God didn't say, this is what I hope for you to achieve. God did say, you will be blessed and you will live long in the land which I give you. So Hosea marries Gomer. Every time I say that name, I think of Gomer Pyle. And I know that's not right, but I grew up in the 60s. What can I say? And she bore him a son, and the son is named Jezreel, which is God sows. Now that's in the footnotes. Did I tell you I always read the footnotes? You'll probably hear me say that a lot. And there it is in verse 4. I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. Now, this is 20 years before it actually happens. On that day, I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Okay. So she conceives again, and they have a daughter, and God says, name her Lo Ruhamah. Now, lo is the Hebrew word for not. And it's not a standalone word. It gets attached onto the Hebrew thing. It means, it's like we use the prefix un. Lo works in the same way. And that poor girl is named Not Pitied. Another way of saying not loved, not cared for. Gee, what a sad name to give a kid. And then she conceives again and has a son, and the son is named Lo Ami. Again, not a fun name, not my people. Notice the syllable as in Abraham or Abram. That's people. I remember about that much Hebrew from taking the language, and you'll probably hear all of it over the course of this hour. All of it that I remember, that is.
Would that also be like the second half of the name Adam?
Absolutely.
People of the ad, the earth.
Yep. And you get all of that. What an awful family. I wonder how well the kids grew up with names like that. It just doesn't seem like it sets you up for a good life, But then in verse 10, remember the covenant? The number of people of Israel shall be like the sands of the sea. That's the covenant with Abraham. You won't be able to count the number of your great-grandchildren, God says to Abraham. They will be innumerable, like the sands of the sea. And where it was said, you are not my people, Lo Ami, it shall be said, children of the living God. Okay, not my people, children of the living God. It's like go away or come on in for a hug. It's good to see hints of the covenant, hints of hope. And I want you to put on your detective glasses and keep your eye out as we go through chapters 1 through 7. Look for those hints of salvation to come. Now, I presume you're probably skimming the text as we go. I'm usually doing that. Anytime we're in Bible study, I'm listening and I'm thinking and I'm reading at the same time. And if you're skimming and you see one that says, ooh, restoration to you, holler it out. I found one. And I will tell you, they're few and far between. But keep your eye out for them. It's like a little bit of salt adding life to the text. Now we get into chapter 2. At least one commentator has described chapter 2 as God's lawsuit against Israel. That it's set up like that. I don't quite see that format here, but I'm only an amateur scholar when it comes to Old Testament. And so I will just share that tidbit with you. You may see it that way. It's like God is laying out the case against Israel for all the things that Israel has done wrong or failed to do to keep up Israel's half of the covenant.
So
Yes.
it already starts with like shifting the children's names.
Yeah.
If Lo is going away from those two names, they're now my people and pity, as opposed to not my people and not pity.
Right.
There in the very beginning of chapter 2.
Mm-hmm. And Jezreel is not there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jezreel is more a place than a person, I think. That's me. You'll see it referred to even in chapter 1, verse 5. On that day, I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel.
Yeah.
But it's not till you read closely that you even begin to see that stuff. I know when I'm reading these texts outside of the context of Bible study or preparing to teach, my eyes tend to glaze over on the unfamiliar place names.
Yeah.
Yeah. Enough so that there are times I've been known in preaching, for instance, to substitute a meaningful local substitute for Israeli place names. I referred to Slap Out, Oklahoma one time in the sermon, had Steve giggling behind me when I did it. Because the reference was to some little nowhere town way out in the boonies. Well, Slap Out, Oklahoma did it, and it's a funny name. But it helps you get the context, because everybody immediately understood what slap out meant. And so I'm just saying, I know how it can be in trying to decipher the names. God's case against Israel is set in the metaphor of marriage. But you see verse 8 in chapter 2, she did not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, and the oil, and who lavished upon her silver and gold that they used for Baal. God's complaint is they're using the gifts of God to worship a foreign entity. Verse 11, I will put an end to all her mirth, her festivals, her new moons, her Sabbaths, and all her appointed festivals. again, a reference to the pagan practices. And in particular, not only to the worship itself, but to the ways that the pagan culture has been appropriated by the Israelis. Israeli sounds like a modern term. I should not use that. The Hebrew people.
Israelite.
Israelites, yeah, that's good, yes. And God presents God's self here as a prophet disciplinarian, trying to guide God's people back into the life that God wants them to have.
Yeah.
I think about this stuff as I was parenting my kids, and now as I watch our grandchildren grow and have a hand in guiding them. It's not so much that you want to slap their hands, although occasionally that's necessary. Don't touch that. But mostly it's let's guide them back to the better path. That's what God is trying to do here. Let's find that better path. And sometimes punishment is a part of that. Look at verse 14, if you would, please. Therefore, I will now allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. From there, I will give her her vineyards and make the valley of Achor a door of hope. There she shall respond as in the days of her youth, as at the time when she came up out of the land of Egypt. Discipline has two sides. One is to make the thing you don't want unattractive, and the other is the attraction side. Come on, Bash, let's do this. Doesn't this look like fun? And here's one of those bits of hope. On that day, says the Lord, you will call me my husband, and no longer will you call me my Baal. For I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, and they will be mentioned no more. I will make for you a covenant on that day with the wild animals, the birds, the creeping things, and I will abolish the bow, the sword, and war from the land, and make you lie down in safety. The covenant is restored.
Well, there's a complete conflation here between supposed Hosea who married Gomer and God, right? Presumably this is still God talking, saying, I will take you for my wife forever.
One of the things that is really hard textually about the book of Hosea is that it can be difficult as a translator to figure out who's speaking. Who's the I here? Is this God speaking through Hosea, or is it Hosea speaking on behalf of God? Not that there's a whole lot of difference conceptually between the two, but the pronouns make a difference.
Have to decide whether to put in quotation marks or not, right?
Exactly. When you're trying to, particularly when you're trying to present in English, which is a much broader language and requires greater precision while having a lot more words available. One thing you need to know about the Hebrew language, it's a very simple, basic agrarian language. There are only about 500 root words in the language. And they're changed by how you put the roots together and by the prefixes and suffixes that are used with them, but they're only about 500 basic roots. Okay. In contrast, the English language is approaching 500,000. Because we keep appropriating words from everywhere and creating new ones. So when you're trying to translate from that spare language into a language like English, You have a lot of wiggle room,
Mhm.
and trying to figure out how to do that faithfully is a challenge.
I think it's important to just say also that it can be misleading, because once you choose English words to use, because English is so much more precise, it gives the impression that the Bible itself was that precise, when in reality, somebody made a choice and it was never that precise. It never could have been that precise. The person who wrote it might have had a meaning in mind, but they had no way of clarifying it to that degree of precision.
Exactly.
And so we get this impression reading the Bible in English that it's very clear, but it is not. And it's so important for us to remember that.
Exactly.
Gee, it never seems very clear to me.
Well, if you are reading it in Hebrew, it would be even less clear.
That is
So,
true.
I mean, I feel like we would like relate to the world so differently if we spoke Hebrew and everything
Oh,
was
yes.
less clear, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, but another thing about Hebrew was they wouldn't say the proud man or the proud woman, they would say the stiff-necked person.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can translate that again and again in English. But when you have a describer that describes bodily function, you can relate to that. In, you know, Native American languages had the same kind of base. They didn't say there goes the goose, they'd say the bird that flies with, you know, they would describe, they use describers,
Mm-hmm.
and that doesn't change.
It's
I don't
very
think.
metaphorical.
Yes, yeah,
And we try to
Yeah.
interpret literally to our detriment.
yeah, that's, I'd like to comment on verse 20, chapter 2.
Mm-hmm.
I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. And I know that must mean biblical knowing of lying. with
It does. It's
marriage,
carnal knowledge.
carnal
Absolutely.
knowledge. Those kinds of things don't change.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And
As-
the whole marriage covenant is not just under the tent with the feast, it's the day-to-day fidelity. And with all the richness and laughter and joy.
Mhm.
And we can lose that around the campfire when we study with mini scrolls.
Yeah.
And when he said, when the text say you will laugh again, those kinds of things, you will know joy. It's the kind of joy that's kind of a knee slapping joy, what everybody gets down on the farm.
Yeah. Yeah, that is exactly right. Thank you.
You know,
Yeah.
I just can't get over that. From the choose a whore, name the kids Pity and go hang yourself or what, you know?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah, my son of suicide. I mean, it's so pitiful.
Mm-hmm.
And we come up again in verse 23,
Okay,
and the loaves are back, but because they're saying, I will have pity on Lo-Ruhamah, and I will say to Lo-Ami, you are merciful. So you put the loaves back in to. let
In
the
order to make the
sentence
point.
Have the
Uh-huh,
good thing.
uh-huh.
Yeah.
I just. I don't know, I'm just thinking of the degree of artful writing,
Yeah.
Mhm.
you know, that can't be washed down, really. I don't know, I'm glad I'm just delighted we're doing the minor prophets with the
Yeah,
major.
I
chord.
think it's a rich study,
Yeah, I think so. too.
and we don't see enough of it
No.
in scripture. I'm going to preach from minor prophets at some point, at least one or two passages while we're doing this. It's just interesting.
I made the promise.
Of course.
I will say though, I decided we should do minor prophets because when I was at my college reunion in June,
Ah,
one of my classmates preached our service on, I believe it was a passage from Hezekiah. So
Mhm.
I was like,
uh-huh.
yeah, we should do that. We never looked at those books. So,
Yeah,
so here we are. Thank you, Rachel.
I was preaching from Jonah one Sunday, and quite unexpectedly, one of my regional ministers was in worship that Sunday. I had no idea they were coming. And so she heard me preaching on Nineveh and Jonah and she quoted that to me years later. Because I had said that when Jonah goes into Nineveh and delivers the message from God, it's 5 words in Hebrew, and it says 40 days and Nineveh will be no more. Well, I was trying to make it 5 words, and I finally came up with it. 40 days and you're toast. And Beth quoted that to me 5 or 6 years later, and she said, I still remember that.
That's it. It's memorable, that kind of
Yeah.
language, yeah.
And, I couldn't have said, they were there on the Sunday I was preaching Jonah, except that she recalled that. Well, okay. But trying to find a way to translate metaphorical language into metaphors that speak to a modern mind. It's a challenge. And the translators, by and large, do a really excellent job, but sometimes it's hard to know how to work with what you got when you don't have a whole lot. So moving on to chapter 3.
I'm sorry, Renee, can I ask a question?
Sure, absolutely.
Is there, I mean, I'm just gonna say, marrying a whore is a rather dramatic metaphor.
It is.
Okay, but is the assumption that if this woman is a whore, she's clearly not an Israelite?
No such assumption.
Were there, okay.
No such
So
assumption.
she was one of the children of Abraham, part of the tribe, but, okay.
Just like Rahab. Held
Yeah.
held up as one of Jesus'
Oh,
ancestors as a
I thought
woman
you
of
said
Rahab.
rehab.
No,
I was like,
Rahab, but yeah, see, that's wonderful, yeah.
So she's not from outside,
No,
within, but from
yeah.
that part of town we don't usually talk about. I mean,
Untouchable.
if you're
Exactly.
Israelite,
Yeah,
you
she's
need
from
to name,
the-
this is rather shocking.
Yeah, she's
Yes.
probably from the
And
side
I
of the
assume it
tracks.
would have been shocking at the time, except, I mean, there's, yes, the marriage metaphor for covenant is very traditional,
Mhm.
right? Bringing a whore into that metaphor is not traditional.
Well, I think
It
she
is- it is
must have
shocking.
been very successful as well because of her wealth, her gold. I think she probably was at the top of her job
So we
description.
can call her a madam if you like.
At least, or
I
design.
don't know. I just.
Could be.
What a name.
It's quite a metaphor. And chapter 3 tells the story again,
Really
except this time it tells it first person.
shocking.
The Lord said to me again. Okay, so Hosea, this is written as if Hosea is telling the story. Go, love a woman who has a lover and is an adulteress. Just as the Lord loves the people of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love raisin cakes. Okay, that needs explanation. Raisin cakes were offered as part of the offering in the temples of Baal. It's fancy food offered to the gods, the other gods. The chapter is very short. It's a quick retelling in first person of what we've already seen in chapters 1 and 2, but it's a great time to look at some of the translation issues. So look at your footnotes, okay? So I bought her, verse 2, I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and a homer of barley and a measure of wine. You have a footnote marking there at measure of wine. Okay. Where it says in the footnote, Greek, Hebrew, a homer of barley and a lethek of barley.
Barley and some more barley.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, see why they didn't go with that translation.
Okay.
Doesn't fill out.
Greek refers to the Septuagint, which is a early Greek translation of Hebrew texts. The Septuagint was prepared from about 300-ish BC through about 100-ish BC. That translation was put together. So the Hebrew texts are already a little dicey by then.
Maybe lethek means barley wine.
I don't think so.
Okay.
It's more like a bushel and a half bushel. or a bushel and a peck, if you will. Um, Let's see, what was the next one? I lost my place on my notes here. Chapter 4.
It's very important, even though chapter 3 is very short. It's important to notice the relationship. He has bought her.
Oh,
So
yeah.
essentially,
Mhm.
he is paying for her services to do absolutely nothing except to serve as a prop to that shocking sermon that will perhaps get through to the Israelites.
Mhm.
She is not to have sexual relations with any other man, and she is not to have sexual relations with the man who owns her.
Mhm.
I think that part, I picked up on that in high school for some reason. And I've never been able to get around the idea that they were not actually husband and wife,
Hmm.
as I had previously thought.
Well, at least not according to this telling of the story.
Yeah, of course.
Now, as it's told in chapter 1, they had 3 children, so
Yeah.
apparently,
Yeah.
Exactly, that's,
So what we have here are perhaps 2 different sermons that have been mushed together.
it could be. Scholars debate whether this is a different wife or the same story being retold. That's kind of a, I mean, which is it? It kind of depends on how you read it, story. I want to continue the textual examination as we get into chapter 4, and we're all about out of time. You're going to have more of Hosea to work with than you thought, Steve.
Oh,
Look at verse 4 in chapter 4. Yet let no one contend and let none accuse, for with you is my contention, O priest. Again, do you have a footnote marking? Mine says meaning of Hebrew, uncertain. Okay. Now what that means in particular is anybody's guess. It could be that the edge of the scroll was crumbled. It could be that the word is simply unknown or in a form that is unfamiliar enough that it could be this or it could be that. A lot of factors go into that translation. This is a best guess based on context.
I want to point out that those verses you read earlier from the article of Christian Country are right before that, they're in chapter 4
Yes,
that she read.
exactly. And then at the last part of verse 7, the more they increased, the more they sinned against me, they changed their glory into shame. And again, if you look at the footnote, it identifies that translation as ancient Hebrew tradition, and then says, MT, I will change their glory into shame. Now, if you don't know what all the abbreviations mean in your footnotes, there's usually an article in the front of the Bible that says, okay, but I'll save you some time. MT is the Masoretic Text, which is a Jewish compilation of Hebrew texts, an attempt to formulate one authoritative text from various copies that circulated and been copied and circulated and copied and circulated. And that was prepared starting in about the 600s through the 900s of the Common Era. So 1,000 years after Hosea. And by and large, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were uncovered in the 1940s, do you remember the Dead Sea Scrolls? That held up publication of the Revised Standard Version, because all of a sudden there were these new scrolls that were more ancient than anything that we had before. And they held up publication of the Revised Standard Version. So some comparisons could be done and a few changes were made, okay, based on having older, better texts. the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls did not include all of the, what we call the Old Testament, but it had a number of Old Testament scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, to a very great degree, upheld the Masoretic Text.
Yeah.
And so they testified to the accuracy and dedication of the work of those Jewish scholars 1,000 years later. And so the Masoretic Text has become even more authoritative as an ancient source. So if you see MT, you probably got something good there to pay attention to, which makes this interesting. The more they sinned against me, I changed their glory into shame. Okay, so who's the actor here? Have you screwed up your own life by sinning against God, or has God screwed up your life because you sinned against God? That answering that question may be a matter of point of view more than anything else. So, okay, chapter 4 is where the prophet speaking stuff begins. Okay. We're done with biography at this point. And the rest of the book is the prophet speaking. Okay. Now, I will say also on the matter of text, one of the factors that's been suggested to explain the translation difficulties, okay, is that although Israel and Judah were, in a sense, one people, okay, they were separated in space long enough, okay, that the language developed differently. Language changes over time. You all know this. Try understanding what your teenage grandchildren are saying, and you'll know language changes. I think we did it when I was a teenager, just so the mom and dad couldn't understand. That was part of the point. It's a little like the difference between American English and British English. Okay. It's been said that America and Great Britain are two countries divided by a common language. And that's part of what's going on here with Hosea. Hosea was in the northern kingdom, speaking in a northern dialect. And when all of these things were gathered together later on, after Hosea was long dead and gone, and the northern kingdom was no more, and this had migrated south and was being gathered up, trying to make sense of it. A little dicey. Okay. So my point when you're doing Bible study, always read the footnotes. Okay. Would someone like to read aloud verses 1 through 3 in Hosea? Chapter 4, 1 through 3, sorry.
Hear the word of the Lord, O people of Israel, for the Lord is in indictment against the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or loyalty and no knowledge of God in the land. Swearing, lying, and murder and stealing and adultery break out. Bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore the land mourns, and all who live in it languish, together with the wild animals and the birds of the air. Even the fish of the sea are perishing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So what's God saying through Hosea here? What's the beef? What's God complaining about?
Ruining everything.
Your unfaithfulness causes your catastrophe. That's what it's saying, I think.
Okay. Given our time, I'm going to kind of skim through and get us through chapter 4, because it's a good summary of what all is going to come in the next 8 or 9 chapters. Okay. Chapter 4 begins where the priests are accused. Okay. They're accused for failing to teach well enough. You didn't do a good enough job of helping people understand the covenant. You have forgotten the law of God. It says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, verse 6, because you have rejected the knowledge. Okay, that's a rather tough indictment. Preachers have a tough enough job already. But the indictments continue. Like people like priests, verse 9, I will punish them for their ways. Because the people are also responsible. It's not all on the preacher's heads. They have forsaken the Lord and devoted themselves to whoredom. Here we go again. The stuff in verse 12 and 13, I find interesting. My people consult a piece of wood, and the divining rod gives them their oracles. I think about that whenever someplace we lived, and I have forgotten where, it seemed like there was a palm reader on every corner. And I recall that when I read stuff like this. People are looking all kinds of places for some kind of insider knowledge that will help them get ahead in life. It's pretty simple. Live the way God wants you to live, God says. And all will be well. They sacrifice on the tops of mountains and make offerings on the hills under the oak, the poplar, and the terebinth. All of those had particular religious significance in the other religions of the area. And therefore, your daughters play the whore, your daughters-in-law commit adultery. I will not punish the daughters when they play the whore, for the men themselves go aside with the whores. I was always kind of glad to see that line. I think of all the towns where we've lived, where the prostitutes are arrested and the Johns go free. That just never quite seemed fair. But then I was raised reading the Gospel of John, where when the woman taken in adultery is brought to Jesus, he says, okay, whereas the other one takes two to tango.
Oh, is that what he said?
Something like that.
It was said, but okay.
My translations never made it into publications. I did enjoy them though, and got a lot of laughs in language classes. The indictment continues all the way through the chapter. I would point out to you in verse 17, Ephraim is joined to idols, let him alone. And like God is saying, I'm done. I've said it enough. Go do what you're going to do anyway. But I point out that chapter 4, verse 17, I point that out because Ephraim is a stand-in for Israel when Hosea is speaking. When you see Ephraim, Ephraim is used as a reference to the whole of the 10 tribes, even though it is one of the 10.
Kind of like Judah is the main.
Judah refers to Judah and Benjamin, but it's like Judah and Benjamin. And so Benjamin just kind of disappears, yeah. Now Ephraim, their area in the northern kingdom is along the southern border, which may be a clue that that's where Hosea was at work. Maybe. Kind of seems that way because I'm a Kansan. I tend to see the world through a Kansas lens. Yeah. Hosea may be the same kind of way, but that's an assumption. Just he likes to use Ephraim as a stand-in for the whole place of the whole nation. But Judah, it doesn't get off the hook. Israel is in verse 15. Though you play the whore, O Israel, do not let Judah become guilty. Judah also is to be on guard. And there's one other word here that I find very interesting. Bethaven, also in verse 15. Beth is house of, one of those Hebrew bits. Bethlehem is house of bread. To give you a familiar term. Bethaven is house of vanity or house of emptiness. You might remember the common translation that begins Ecclesiastes. Vanity of vanity, says the preacher, all is vanity. It's another way of saying nothingness. And this is Bethaven, house of nothingness. Do not go up to the house of nothingness, there's nothing there. That will appear a number of times through this reading. Any other questions about chapter 4 or anything we've read so far? And you have a minus 2 minutes to ask those questions.
That's titled very well.
I think verse 19 should be read aloud. It sounds like poetry, but it also sums it up.
A wind has wrapped them in its wings, and they shall be ashamed because of their altars.
Who you really worship.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Mhm. It's beautiful metaphorical language, but it's all really rather depressing.
It's very harsh.
That's why I want you, as you read the rest of the book this week, here's your assignment, folks, actually read this. It's a good thing. huh? Be on the lookout, be a detective looking for those hints of salvation coming up. Any other assignments that you wish to give for next week, Steve?
Actually, reading it is it.
Okay. See you next week for more fun. I'm not teaching next week because it's my birthday and Rebecca's and Mike's.
It is.
Maybe we should build a high.
See you, Zoomers.
Thank you.